키토 관련 영상에 꼭 달리는 댓글 중 하나가 바로 콜레스테롤 수치에 대한 우려입니다. 그래서 전에도 이와 관련한 영상을 올린 적이 있는데요. 이번 영상에서는 여러분의 혈액검사 결과지를 들고 직접 확인해 볼 수 있는 구체적인 수치들이 등장합니다. 호주에는 로우카브 다운언더라는 저탄수화물 교육단체가 있는데요. 본 영상은 이 단체의 2018년 행사에서 스포츠의학 전문의인 폴 메이슨 박사가 진행한 강연 내용입니다. 조금 어려운 내용일 수는 있지만 끝까지 시청하신다면 콜레스테롤에 대한 불안감이 사라지고 가벼운 마음으로 키토 식단을 이어갈 수 있을 거예요. 그는 먼저 LDL은 콜레스테롤과 전혀 다른 개념의 물질이라는 점부터 명확히 짚고 넘어갑니다.
So I'd like to start by sharing a story about one of my patients. He was a 48-year-old male. And when he walked in, I did a double take. I really didn't know why he was there. I mean, he looked ripped. But as it turns out, he had a rather unique problem. You see, he had recently applied for health insurance, income protection insurance. And he had received this letter from the insurance company. Apparently, they felt that he was high risk. This is a recent photo. Not a skerrick fat. He's 48 years old, people. This is his DEXA scan. The blue areas represent lean tissue. The red areas represent fat. So why did his insurance company refuse to insure him? Why did they think he was a bad risk? Well, it was his cholesterol levels. They were high. This is his test result, and the insurer based their decision based on this test. So down the right-hand side, you can see what we call the reference ranges with a lower and an upper value. And if a result falls outside of this reference range, it's considered abnormal. And what I've done here is I've highlighted 3 of his results which fell outside this range. His total cholesterol, his HDL, which stands for high density lipoprotein, and his LDL, which stands for low density lipoprotein. But if I was his insurer, based on this result, I would have signed him up right away. And to understand why, let's take a closer look at exactly what we're looking at when we look at these numbers. So the term cholesterol is very loosely but incorrectly used to refer to a number of different particles in our blood that carry fat around our body. And there's 5 major classes of these particles, and their correct name is lipoprotein. Now, a little bit confusingly, one of the fats that these carry around the body is actually cholesterol. But to call these lipoproteins cholesterol is a bit like mistaking a horse float for a horse. It just really doesn't make any sense. And we can differentiate between these lipoproteins based on their size and their density. And the lipoprotein on the bottom left, the big one, that's the least dense, the biggest, that's formed after we eat. But by the time we do a fasting blood test, the chylomicrons have basically disappeared from our blood. So we don't need to focus on chylomicrons anymore. Now, in yellow, you can see 3 lipoproteins which are linked by arrows: VLDL, IDL, and LDL. This stands for very low density lipoprotein, intermediate density lipoprotein, and low density lipoprotein. And the reason I've linked them by arrows is to demonstrate that they are essentially the same particle. So they all start out as the big one, the VLDL, and then as it circulates around our body, it donates some of its cargo to tissues. That's what they're meant to do. And as it offloads its cargo, they shrink. They get a little bit smaller. It's like a deflating balloon, but they're still the same particle. And finally, up on the top right here, you can see HDL, which is colloquially known as good cholesterol, with higher levels generally considered favourable. Now, you've also probably heard of LDL referred to as bad cholesterol. But the LDL we're looking at here, in fact, is not deleterious in any way. I'd be quite happy to have a bunch of that in my circulation. And I do. But not all LDL is good. It can turn bad if it mixes with the wrong crowd. And that wrong crowd is sugar, or more specifically glucose. If we expose LDL to glucose, it can be damaged in a process called glycation, and that then leads that damaged particle to be vulnerable to a process called oxidation. And both of these damaging steps make the particle fractionally smaller. You've probably heard of small dense LDL before. That's what it is. It's been damaged, and it's damaged as a consequence of exposure to sugar. This damaged LDL is what leads to heart disease, not the other stuff.
우리는 흔히 LDL을 나쁜 콜레스테롤이라고 부릅니다. 이것이 혈관을 막고 심장병을 일으킨다고 생각하죠. 하지만 폴 메이슨 박사의 설명대로 LDL은 콜레스테롤이 아닙니다. 그래서 이 나쁜 콜레스테롤이라는 잘못된 표현이 모든 혼란의 출발점이 되는 것 같아요. 콜레스테롤은 우리의 생명을 유지하는데 꼭 필요한 연료입니다. 세포를 안정화하고 각종 호르몬, 신경물질, 비타민 D, 그리고 지방 소화에 필요한 담즙산을 합성하는 재료가 되죠. 그리고 LDL은 이런 콜레스테롤과 지방을 필요한 세포로 운반하는 배송기사 역할을 합니다. LDL이 없다면 우리가 섭취한 오메가3, 비타민 A, D, E, K, 코엔자임 Q10 같은 지용성 영양소를 먹어도 몸에서 전혀 활용되지 못합니다. 또 LDL은 면역 기능에도 관여합니다. 세균의 독소를 중화하고 혈관이나 세포가 손상되면 그 부위로 콜레스테롤을 운반해 조직이 복구될 수 있도록 돕습니다. 그래서 오히려 LDL 수치가 지나치게 낮아지면 이 모든 기능에 제약이 생기기 시작합니다. 피로감이 심해지고 질병에도 취약해지며 호르몬 불균형으로 근육 감소, 생리불순, 성기능 저하, 그리고 신경세포를 제대로 형성하지 못해 기억력이 떨어지고 우울감이 생기는 등 신체적, 정신적 기능이 모두 무너질 수 있습니다. 이렇게 LDL은 한 가지 특정한 역할을 하는 게 아니라 우리 몸이 살아 움직이기 위해 반드시 필요한 물질입니다. 이런 LDL을 무조건 낮추려는 건 마치 도로가 복잡하니까 자동차를 없애려는 것과 같습니다. 그렇게 하면 사고도 줄고 도로는 깨끗해지겠지만 모든 도시의 기능과 물류 시스템이 마비되겠죠. 그래서 결국 건강을 위해서는 LDL 수치를 억지로 낮추는 게 아니라 LDL이 건강한 상태로 작동하도록 돕는 게 중요합니다. 이제 그는 우리가 LDL 수치를 확인하기 위해 받는 혈액검사의 한계점에 대해 이야기합니다.
So now we know what the different types of lipoproteins are, let's have another look at my patient's cholesterol panel. Now, you'll notice one thing where it says cholesterol 8.8, and this is in millimoles a litre. This is the units that we use in Australia and the UK. Now, the breakdown of the cholesterol underneath that doesn't add up to the total cholesterol. And there's a very good reason for this. Because this panel is missing some of the lipoproteins that we just saw, which we know exist. And the reason they're missing is because they're not actually measured on a standard blood test. You see, centrifuging the blood to spin it down so that you can actually measure the particles is a time-consuming and expensive procedure. So it's usually not done. So instead, some values are calculated, which is really a euphemistic term for saying they're guessed. So VLDL we know exists, but it's actually not listed here. But it is actually estimated as a part of the calculation for LDL. It's estimated. IDL here, in actual fact, is assumed to be absent. Makes it a bit easier to do the calculations if we pretend it's not there, right? So then, we use these assumed values to calculate our LDL. So is it any wonder that accuracy is not always guaranteed? At least the HDL's measured. Now, one alternative to all of this guesswork would be to centrifuge the sample and actually measure these particles individually. And that's what I often do. So what we do, we get the sample and we place it in a gel. And then we spin the gel down, and as we spin it, the particles sink into the gel at different rates and different depths, depending on how big they are and what density they are. And you can see here, the dark spots represent peaks of the different LDL populations. And the results are presented something like this. And you can see that the peaks actually correlate with the dark spots in the gel. So we can actually measure this. Now, I just want to focus for a moment where it says LDL, when we've divided it into 7 sections. And I just want you to have a look at the peak. It's a nice, smooth peak. There's only one peak, and this is because it represents a healthy population of LDL. The fact that there's only one peak means that there's not been any change in size due to damage of the LDL. They've not been glycated, they've not been oxidised. And this is what we call a pattern A LDL. This is healthy. Now, if the particles were damaged, I would expect to see more than one peak. So, well, let's have a closer look at what happens with the LDL when it does hang out with the wrong crowd and when it does get damaged. First of all, it gets exposed to sugar, glucose, and that causes glycation, shrinks a little bit, and then it makes it very vulnerable to oxidation. And interestingly, this oxidative process has been shown to be significantly accelerated when we have an excess of omega-6 fats, the kinds found in vegetable and seed oils. There is a connection. So let's come back to this graph here. And up the top, well, now to our single LDL, let's add the two damaged populations. So let's see if we put that sample into a gel tube and spun it down, what would it look like? So have a look at the middle blob where the LDL is represented. And now you can see it spread out. And you can see, in this example, two distinct populations of LDL. And down the bottom, not of the sample here, but another one of my patients, just for illustrative purposes, you can see here, in the LDL, you have 3 distinct peaks. This is pattern B LDL. This is the dangerous LDL. And you need to understand, it doesn't occur because of saturated fats. It occurs because it's damaged by sugar. It's damaged by blood glucose level.
일반적으로 LDL이 높아지면 건강에 적신호로 여겨집니다. 저는 그 관점이 완전히 틀렸다고 생각하지는 않습니다. 실제로는 그런 경우가 많으니까요. LDL이 높은 사람들 중에는 식습관이 좋지 않고 운동도 부족하고 혈당이 높고 체중이 많이 나가는 경우가 많습니다. 즉 그들의 혈액 속에 많은 건 건강한 LDL이 아니라 손상된 LDL일 것입니다. 문제는 숫자가 아니라 LDL의 상태입니다. 하지만 키토 식단을 한번 생각해 봅시다. 이 식단으로 인해 혈당이 낮아지고 살이 빠지고 컨디션이 좋아지고 피부가 맑아지고 전반적인 건강 상태가 엄청나게 좋아졌는데 상식적으로 손상된 LDL이 혈관에 쌓이고 있다면 이런 변화가 있을 수 있을까요? 키토 식단에서는 탄수화물 섭취를 줄이면서 혈당이 낮게 유지되니까 LDL이 당화 손상될 상황이 거의 벌어지지 않습니다. 또한 키토는 꼼꼼한 기준으로 지방을 섭취합니다. 식물성 기름으로 튀긴 음식이나 트랜스 지방 덩어리인 가공식품을 멀리하고 그 자리를 건강한 버터, 동물성 지방, 치즈 같은 자연적인 지방으로 대체합니다. 그 결과 나쁜 기름으로 인한 산화 스트레스도 현저히 줄어듭니다. 그러니 키토로 인해 오르는 LDL은 손상되지 않은 패턴 A LDL일 가능성이 높습니다. 물론 여전히 LDL이 상승하는 것에 대한 우려가 있을 수 있는데요. 키토식을 하면 몸이 포도당 대신 지방을 주 에너지원으로 사용합니다. 탄수화물 중심의 식단에서는 혈당의 오르내림을 피할 수는 없습니다. 마찬가지로 지방을 연료로 쓰는 키토식에서 지방 섭취를 늘리면 운반해야 할 지방과 콜레스테롤의 양 자체가 많아지니까 LDL이 오르는 게 너무나도 당연하고 자연스러운 현상입니다. 이처럼 LDL이 오르는 건 위험한 게 아니라 새로운 연료 시스템에 적응하는 과정입니다. 이제 폴 메이슨 박사는 손상된 LDL이 우리 몸 안에서 어떻게 작용하며 어떤 과정을 통해 혈관을 망가뜨리는지를 설명합니다.
So to understand why it's so damaging and can lead to blockage of our blood vessels, let's have a look at the normal life cycle of VLDL once it's secreted from the liver. So as it donates its cargo, it shrinks in size through the intermediate stage and finally ends up at low density lipoprotein. And then the low density lipoproteins are able to be taken back up by the liver or by cells in the peripheral tissues. And they use something which I've shown here in blue, which is called an LDL receptor. And these LDL receptors are able to specifically recognize the LDL particles. And that's because there's a special protein on the LDL particles which we call ApoB100. And you can think of this like a security swipe card. If you don't have a security swipe card, or if you've snapped it in two, it's broken, you can't get in that door. So if we have a look at an LDL, In green here is the ApoB100 protein. There's a very important point here. There's only one of these proteins for every LDL molecule. There is no redundancy. If you break it, it does not work. There's no backup. And if it's working properly, this is the security swipe card that will allow the LDL receptors to recognise it and take it out of circulation. Now the problem is, the sugar damage actually targets the proteins. It actually targets this. That means the LDL receptor won't be able to recognise this particle. I don't know who you are. You're not welcome here. Persona non grata. Go away. So what happens in that situation? Well, VLDL's coming out of the liver, converted to IDL, LDL, and then the LDL gets damaged. So that means it's not recognised at these receptors. So then what happens? It begins to accumulate. Their numbers then increase in the circulation. And this is when we see what's called a high LDL particle count. Now, one thing you need to know, because at the end of their journey, they've donated most of their cargo. So they're quite small. So the absolute volume of LDL is not necessarily going to be that high, but the number of particles is. And this is why the LDL particle count has quite useful predictive value for heart disease, because it reflects these damaged, small, dense particles that are small and can't be taken out of the circulation. So if they can't be taken out of the circulation in a normal, healthy way, what happens to them? Well, they end up here. They line the inside of our arteries. So you can see on top of the deposit there, you've got a thin layer of cells. That layer on top is just one cell thick. It's called the endothelium. And this fatty deposit occurs underneath that layer. And we can see from this graph here, so in yellow here, we're graphing oxidized LDL in the circulation. And you can see that an increase in oxidized LDL is what actually precedes the development of this atheroma inside the blood vessel, which we can see in red. As you take the oxidized LDL out of circulation, it ends up deposited in the lining of the blood vessels. So how does the LDL actually get through this layer that's one cell thick? Well, oxidized LDL has the effect of increasing the permeability of this layer. That's been shown in a lot of scientific articles. So if you have oxidized LDL, this membrane becomes a little bit leaky or porous, and the LDL particles are able to travel to the underside of it. And then once they're underneath, they come in contact with a cell called a macrophages. So remember how the LDL receptors would only recognise healthy LDL? Well, these macrophages have a receptor called a scavenger receptor that only recognises damaged LDL. It's quite convenient. They have a very strong affinity for it. So what they do, the LDL particle binds with the scavenger receptor and it engulfs it, a little bit like a Pac-Man. And then eventually these macrophages end up so full of LDL that we call them foam cells. And here you can see a foam cell with all the lipid droplets inside. And this is the way in which damaged LDL ends up lining the inside of our blood vessels. And this is the end result. This artery here is called the left anterior descending artery. It's the main artery supplying the heart muscle. And it's been injected with dye. So you can see the internal lumen, the diameter of the lumen. And you can see here, that's a significant narrowing. And that is caused by LDL that's been damaged by sugar. And that's why HbA1c is such a brilliant blood test for predicting heart disease, because HbA1c looks at how sugar damages or attaches to the red blood cells. It correlates with high blood glucose levels. And we know that high blood glucose levels are what will also damage our LDL. And that's why diabetics have a significantly higher rate of heart attacks.
폴 메이슨 박사는 LDL이 손상되는 주된 원인이 바로 혈당에 의한 당화 반응이라고 말합니다. 즉, 혈당이 높을수록 LDL 입자가 손상될 가능성도 커진다는 뜻이죠. 이 부분에서 저는 꼭 짚고 넘어가고 싶은 게 있습니다. 바로 요즘 건강 커뮤니티에서 자주 언급되는 당독소 이야기입니다. 제가 고기를 노릇하게 구워 먹는 영상을 올리면 당독소가 위험하니 반드시 삶아 먹어야 한다는 댓글이 달리곤 합니다. 실제로 그런 이유로 육류를 삶거나 찌는 방식으로만 고집하는 분들도 꽤 많은 것 같습니다. 하지만 우리가 당독소를 피하려는 가장 큰 이유는 그것이 체내에서 LDL을 비롯한 단백질을 당화시켜 염증이나 노화를 촉진할 수 있다는 우려 때문일 겁니다. 그런데 한 가지 생각해 볼 점이 있습니다. 정말로 구운 고기 속 당독소가 그대로 흡수돼서 몸에서 당화 반응을 일으킨다면 4년 동안 구운 고기를 굉장히 많이 자주 먹어온 저의 당화 혈색소 수치가 높게 나와야 하지 않을까요? 그런데 식단을 바꾼 뒤 제 당화 혈색소 수치는 정상 범위에서 벗어난 적이 없습니다. 이건 저뿐 아니라 여러 연구에서도 확인된 사실입니다. 음식으로 먹는 외인성 당독소는 대부분 흡수되지 않거나 일부 흡수되더라도 대부분 체외로 배출됩니다. 연구마다 차이는 있지만 흡수율은 약 10% 이하로 보고됩니다. 음식의 당독소가 건강에 미치는 영향은 아직은 찬반이 존재하는 불명확한 영역입니다. 즉, 우리가 먹는 음식 속 당독소가 당화 반응을 일으키는 주범이라고 보긴 어렵습니다. 진짜 문제는 몸 안에서 스스로 만들어내는 내인성 당화 반응입니다. 혈당이 높고 인슐린 저항성이 있는 상태에서는 내인성 당화 반응과 산화 스트레스가 커지며 염증 반응이 활성화됩니다. 저는 당독소의 존재를 부정하거나 완전히 무해하다는 주장을 하려는 게 아닙니다. 하지만 한 가지 수치에 너무 몰입하다 보면 전체적인 맥락을 놓치게 됩니다. 만약 당독소가 음식을 선택하는 유일한 기준이 된다면 음식에 열을 가하지 않는 생식이 건강에 가장 이롭다고 할 수 있을 것입니다. 하지만 현실은 그렇지 않죠. 실제로 당독소를 훨씬 많이 먹게 되는 키토나 카니보어 식단을 하는 사람들이 염증 지수와 당화 혈색소 수치가 극적으로 낮아지며 건강이 좋아지는 사례는 수없이 많습니다. 당독소의 관점으로만 보면 불가사의한 일로 보이겠지만 그 이유는 사실 간단합니다. 그들은 혈당을 안정화시키고 내인성 당화가 일어나기 어려운 대사 환경을 유지하기 때문입니다. 그래서 당독소 섭취를 줄이는 것보다 제가 훨씬 중요하게 생각하는 건 당화 반응이 잘 일어나지 않는 체내 환경을 조성하고 해독과 배출을 잘 할 수 있도록 건강한 대사 상태를 만드는 것입니다. 그렇다면 우리가 정말 두려워해야 할 것은 고기의 마이야르 반응이나 검게 태운 커피가 아니라 혈당을 그야말로 폭발시키는 달달한 디저트, 아이스크림, 설탕으로 범벅된 고탄수화물 간식입니다. 특히 과당은 포도당에 비해 당화 반응성이 몇 배나 높게 일어난다고 합니다. 그러니 가공식품에 들어가는 설탕이나 고과당 옥수수 시럽은 반드시 피하셔야 합니다. 자, 이제 혈액검사지를 들고 함께 확인해 볼 차례입니다. 참고로 폴 메이슨 박사는 호주 사람이고 그에게 익숙한 밀리몰이라는 단위로 설명하고 있는데요. 자막에서는 국내에서 사용하는 단위인 밀리그램으로 변경해서 표시하겠습니다.
Now for the good news. We can often tell if you're pattern A or pattern B based on a standard blood test. Despite the limitations of it and the inherent inaccuracies within it, we still get a lot of very important information, and we often might not need to do any further testing. So we're going to look at two things. And the first thing we're going to look at is called the triglycerides. So in this patient here, you can see they've got an abnormal triglyceride, an abnormally low triglyceride, which makes me question the reference ranges. But they've got a high total cholesterol. So let's have a look at how triglycerides relate to pattern A and pattern B. So in this paper here, you can see the green line represents pattern A and the red line represents pattern B. The higher the green line is, the more likely it is to be a pattern A cholesterol. The higher the red line, more likely it is to be pattern B. And along the bottom, you can see the triglyceride levels. In yellow are the units for the UK and Australia, and in blue they're the units used in the US and in Europe. Now, we can see, if we're looking at the red line, that if our triglycerides are less than 0.5 millimoles a litre, then you're almost certainly going to have a pattern A phenotype. But if we go down the other side, if your triglycerides are over 2, your chances of having a bad phenotype are very, very high. And remember this example we just looked at, they had a level of 0.4, so they're going to be very, very comfortable. The other factor that's really useful on this blood test is the HDL level. This is another patient, high total cholesterol and a high HDL cholesterol. Let's have a look at the similar kind of graph for this patient. So again, we have the good phenotype in green and the pattern B in red, except this time, as the number goes higher, it looks better. So we can see that if your HDL cholesterol, and I use the term loosely, is less than about 0.4 or 0.5, you're almost certainly going to have a bad profile. However, if you have over 1.5, you're singing easy. And the one example we just saw, 2.6, doesn't even register on this scale. That's what a ketogenic diet can do. So let's have a look at my patient who was denied insurance. And let's have a look at his results on each of these and see how informative that can be. So his triglycerides are 0.9. It's certainly down the good end, but would you sign off on it? I don't know. There's a grey area. But have a look at his HDL, 1.7, clearly in the green zone. I didn't need to do any further testing on him. I wasn't worried about his cholesterol levels. Even without doing a subfraction, I was confident that he was pattern A. Now, there's one more metric that we can use to assess for pattern A and B, and that's when we use the power of triglyceride and HDL together. And that's when we calculate what's called the triglyceride to HDL ratio. We divide the triglyceride by the HDL. Now, in his case, millimoles a litre, his came out at 0.53. So let's see where this fits on a similar kind of graph. So in green, in yellow, remember the Australian units, if it's under 0.8, it's good. So if his has got a 0.5, again, he can rest easy. If it was over 1.8, then we'd almost be certain he had a pattern B. And if it's in the intermediate zone, well, that's when we need to think a little bit harder. So just for the benefit of some of our international audience, so these are very conservative numbers. These are how I interpret the data, and I'm sure there's a lot of other people who could interpret it slightly differently, and I'm probably a bit more conservative than most people. I don't like to leave a lot of room for doubt. But in Australia, if you're under 0.8 in terms of millimoles a litre, or in the US, if you're under 1.8 with milligrams, then you can probably rest easy. So if I'm interpreting a blood test, I'll usually look at the triglycerides. If they're good, happy days. If not, try the HDL. If that's good, excellent. If not, we move on to the triglyceride HDL ratio. And almost every one of my patients who has been on a ketogenic diet for a sustained period of time will end up having at least one of those figures, usually 2 or 3, looking excellent. And if it's not, then we have to have a bit of a think. And that's an individual decision. Do we do an HbA1c? Do we do a coronary artery calcium score? Do we do lipid subfraction? There's a lot of other tests we can do. Inflammatory markers, which are also very predictive, and we look at the whole picture. But what you do next should be discussed with your doctor. So to finish, I'd like to conclude a few things. So having a high LDL is not always a bad thing. Having damaged LDL is. And remember, it's not damaged by fat, it's damaged by sugar. High carbohydrate diets and having a high blood glucose level is what will lead to these pathogenic, damaging LDL particles. You can use your triglyceride, or you could use HDL to evaluate a blood test to estimate whether it's likely to be pattern A or pattern B. And if you have pattern A, then doesn't have any significant association with any increases in cardiovascular risk. And finally, as far as my patient was concerned, if I was the insurance company, just sign him up. He looks fantastic. Thank you.
이제 폴 메이슨 박사의 기준을 저의 실제 혈액검사 결과지에 대입해 보겠습니다. 참고로 이 수치는 제가 지난 3월 건강검진에서 받은 혈액검사 결과입니다. 제 총 콜레스테롤은 363, LDL은 260, HDL은 92입니다. 아마 이 숫자만 보면 의사들이 깜짝 놀랄 겁니다. 실제로 저는 검사 이후 다시 병원을 방문하라는 연락을 받았습니다. 이어서 계산에 필요한 지표들도 살펴보겠습니다. 중성지방은 57입니다. 공복혈당은 86, 당화혈색소는 5.2입니다. 그는 먼저 중성지방 44 이하, 그리고 여기서 통과 못하면 HDL 58 이상, 그 다음은 중성지방을 HDL로 나눈 값이 1.8 이하라는 단계별 기준치를 제시했습니다. 이 수치들을 단계별로 확인하고 이 기준에서 벗어나면 다른 세부적인 지표를 살펴보거나 의사의 검진이 필요하다고 했죠. 이 기준을 제 수치에 적용해보면 먼저 제 중성지방이 높지는 않지만 기준을 통과하지는 못했네요. 그럼 다음으로 넘어가서 HDL은 예시로 둔 환자와 비슷한 수준으로 기준치를 가볍게 통과했습니다. 그 다음 중성지방을 HDL로 나눈 값은 0.61로 안전한 범위 안에 확실하게 들어와 있습니다. 여기에 공복혈당과 당화혈색소도 기준치보다 낮으니 패턴 A, 즉 건강한 LDL 유형이라고 판단할 수 있습니다. 여러분도 최근에 검사한 혈액검사지가 있다면 이 기준으로 한번 확인해 보시기 바랍니다. 정리하자면 LDL 수치가 높으면서 HDL은 낮고 중성지방과 공복혈당, 당화혈색소 수치가 높다면 문제가 있을 가능성이 큽니다. 하지만 LDL과 HDL이 모두 높고 중성지방, 공복혈당, 당화혈색소가 낮다면 그건 충분히 건강한 상태라고 봐도 될 것 같습니다. 결국 중요한 건 LDL 숫자보다 그것을 둘러싼 체내 환경입니다. 폴 메이슨 박사도 제 수치를 봤다면 괜찮다고 하지 않았을까요? 보험가입에는 제약이 생길 수도 있겠지만요. 이상한 다이어트였습니다.